She did not scream. That was the part Caleb would never be able to explain. Not to his lawyers, not to his board, not to himself in the months that followed when the silence of that room kept finding him at 3 a.m. in places he had no right to sleep peacefully. He had run the scenario in the back of his mind more times than he would ever admit, had rehearsed the geometry of it, the raised voice, the thrown accusation, the storm he could weather and reframe and eventually outlast. He knew how to handle a woman who broke. He had built an entire life on the assumption that she would. None of it came. The residence occupied the 58th floor, all glass and deliberate light, a room designed to remind every person who entered it exactly who owned the view. Caleb had chosen it for that reason specifically, the way the city spread below like something that had agreed to be looked at. He was already mid-sentence, already laughing at something, when the front door opened. She stopped just inside the living room. She was still in her uniform, Army combat uniform, multicam pattern, her name pressed in black block letters above the U.S. Army tape across her chest. She had come directly from a classified operational debrief, the kind that ran 6 hours and that Caleb had never had the clearance to know existed. Her patrol cap was still squared on her head. Her posture was the kind of upright that does not come from instruction. It comes from years of decisions made under conditions that would have ended most people. She stood with one hand rising slowly, pressing flat against her sternum, not clutching, not dramatic, the quiet, almost clinical pressure of a woman taking her own measure before she moves. Her face. Her face was the part that would hollow him out. Rich, dark skin, lit from somewhere deep inside, the particular glow of someone whose stillness is not absence, but concentration. Her eyes, large and steady and fixed on him, were not empty with shock. They were full of something older and far more deliberate, the exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying classified weight in silence for years and has finally finished the last calculation. Her brows drew together, not in anguish, but in the quiet, exacting focus of a tactician acquiring a final target. Her lips pressed together once, trembled, held. A single tear moved down her left cheek. She did not wipe it. Behind her, at a distance that announced nothing and explained everything, stood a man in a black suit, still, hands at his sides. He was not looking at Caleb. He was not looking at the woman in the red dress whose arms were still looped around Caleb's chest like a claim being filed in real time. He was looking only at Jane. He had been looking only at Jane for 2 years. Caleb's jaw went tight, his shoulders locked into the particular posture of a man who was not sorry, only interrupted. There is a difference between those two things. It is a vast difference. It is the distance between a man who understands what he has done and a man who is already calculating how to reframe it. Caleb was already calculating. He had told his head of acquisitions 4 days before this moment, voice easy and sure, the kind of confidence that does not need an audience, but performs for one anyway. She's military. She doesn't have anything outside of this. She'd never leave. She has nowhere to go. He had believed it completely. That belief was about to become the most expensive thing he had ever owned. Jane did not speak. She looked at him for 4 seconds. She counted them. Then she adjusted her hand against her sternum, one small, precise movement, the way a soldier confirms what she is carrying before she moves, and she turned, and she walked back out the front door. No words, no shattered glass, no ugly, bargainable grief, just the soft close of a door that had already decided. Caleb stared at the space where she had been and told himself she would be back by morning. What he did not know, what he had never once thought to ask, was that she had stopped needing to come back 96 hours ago. He just hadn't noticed the building was already hollow.
If you've ever had the discipline to say nothing, when saying nothing was the sharpest move in the room, this story was written for you. Subscribe, hit the bell, and drop a comment right now telling me where in the world you're watching from, because what Jane does in the next 96 hours is going to permanently redefine what walking away looks like. And the quiet man in the black suit? Caleb never once thought to ask who he really was. That was his second mistake. She did not go back for anything. That was the first thing Caleb would misread, the way she left without a bag, without a word, without the particular performance of departure that people use to signal they want to be followed. He would tell himself it meant she was coming back. He would be wrong, but he would hold that belief carefully, the way a man holds something he cannot afford to put down. Jane had come straight from the debrief. 6 hours in a room with no windows, no personal devices, no record of her presence that Caleb's clearance level could ever locate. The kind of work that doesn't appear on a resume because the people who matter already know, and the people who don't never will. She had driven directly from the base. She had not called ahead. There had been no reason to call ahead. The elevator opened on the 58th floor, and she heard him before she saw him. His laugh, easy and unguarded, the specific register of a man who believes he is unobserved. She had cataloged that laugh over 4 years of marriage. She knew its frequencies. She knew the difference between the version he performed in boardrooms and the version that came out when he thought the room was entirely his. This was the second version. She stopped in the doorway of the living room. The woman in the red dress did not pull away. That was the part Jane filed quietly and permanently, not with anger, but with the clean, decisive notation of someone updating a threat assessment in real time. The woman's arms remained where they were, her chin tilted slightly toward Jane with the composure of someone who had been told more than once that there was nothing here to be afraid of. Caleb saw her. His last stopped. His shoulders moved first, the instinctive recalibration of a man whose body understands the situation before his mind has finished constructing the excuse. His jaw tightened. His eyes did the thing eyes do when the wrong calculation has just been confirmed. A brief and voluntary widening, then the rapid recovery of a man who has decided that confidence is still his best available position. Jane looked at him for 4 seconds. She counted them the way she counted everything, without attachment, without drama, as data. Then she pressed her hand flat against her sternum, finger straight, palm steady, took 1 breath, noted the time on the watch at her left wrist with a single downward glance, and she walked out. No door slam, no final word positioned for impact. The door closed behind her with the quiet, definitive sound of something that has already been decided. Caleb stood in the center of the room and watched the space where she had been. "She'll be back," he said. Not to the woman in the red dress, not to himself exactly, to the version of events he had already decided to believe. She had not left in anger. That was the thing about Jane that Caleb had never once correctly understood. She did not operate from anger. Anger was a resource. And she had learned a long time ago, in environments far less forgiving than a 58th floor penthouse, that resources spent on emotion were resources unavailable for execution. She had begun 72 hours ago. While Caleb sat in the first of the 3 consecutive board meetings she had quietly arranged through his executive assistant, meetings she had populated with the kinds of agenda items that would keep him present, engaged, and entirely out of her way, Jane had returned to the apartment and gone directly to the secondary terminal in the study, hers. He had never asked about the distinction. That, too, she had noted and filed. The Meridian framework had taken her 3 years to build. She had started it during her second deployment cycle, working the architecture in the margins of classified downtime, developing the encryption logic in a language 2 generations ahead of anything Caleb's development team had been trained to read. She had finished the core structure on the floor of their kitchen at 4 a.m. on a Tuesday, back against the cabinet, laptop balanced on her knees, while Caleb slept off a fundraising gala in the room above her. She had not woken him to tell him. There had seemed, at the time, no reason to. That was the flaw she had already corrected. Caleb had taken the framework to his first Pentagon liaison meeting 11 months after she completed it. He had presented it in a folder with his company's letterhead and answered every technical question with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed the vocabulary without understanding the language. The liaisons had been impressed. The contracts had followed. The company's valuation had tripled inside 18 months, and Caleb had stood at a podium at an industry dinner and thanked his team for their vision. Jane had watched from a table near the back and said nothing.
She had already understood by then that silence is not the same as surrender. Silence, held correctly, is infrastructure. It is the load-bearing wall that everything else is built against. And the thing about a load-bearing wall is that the person who knows where it actually sits has always had more power than the person who simply lives in the building. She transferred the core files to the biometric drive in 41 minutes. Everything that was hers. Every line of original architecture, time-stamped, authenticated, traceable to her credentials and her alone. She ejected the drive and pressed it into the interior pocket of her uniform jacket, directly over her sternum, where it would remain until she decided otherwise. Then she opened the second window. The decommission sequence was 11 characters long. She had written it 6 weeks ago and saved it under a file name that would read to anyone who looked as a routine maintenance note. No one had looked. She entered the passphrase, let her thumb rest on the biometric pad, and she hit execute. Not with ceremony, not with satisfaction, but with the same clean, forward attention she brought to everything. The mission had always been this. Caleb had simply never been cleared to know it existed. Nothing happened. That was the point. She had designed it that way. The absence of immediate consequence, the clean, unmarked surface of a command it did not announce itself. No confirmation dialogue, no system alert, no timestamp visible to anyone without her specific partition access. To Caleb's IT infrastructure, which she had also designed, the sequence would read as scheduled maintenance for the next 31 hours. By the time it read as anything else, there would be nothing left to read. She watched the screen return to its neutral state and felt nothing she needed to name. The decommission was not a bomb. She had been precise about that in the architecture, the same way she was precise about everything that mattered. A bomb was visible. A bomb gave the target time to respond, to counter, to reframe the narrative around their own survival. What she had executed was something quieter and far more permanent. A tide, pulling back from the shore of every government clearance Caleb's firm had ever been granted, slow enough that no single contractor would notice until the water was already gone. 48 hours, possibly 52. The variation depended on which server the credential requests hit first. She had accounted for both scenarios. She stood from the terminal and did not look at the screen again. The drive was already in her interior pocket, pressed flat against her sternum beneath the uniform jacket. She could feel its weight, not heavy, not dramatic, just present the way important things are present, the way a decision already made settles into the body and stops requiring attention. 3 years of architecture, every original file, every time-stamped build log that would trace the Meridian framework back to her credentials and no one else's. Caleb's name appeared nowhere in the underlying code. It never had. She picked up her patrol cap from the desk where she had set it and pressed it into place with both hands, 2 fingers above the brow line, level, squared. She looked at the room for 3 seconds. The secondary terminal, dark now. The shelf of technical manuals she had annotated in the margins because she thought in margins. The photograph on the far wall that she had chosen and he had taken credit for choosing. She turned off the light. The hallway was quiet in the way of expensive buildings, the kind of quiet that costs money to construct and is meant to signal permanence. She walked its length without adjusting her pace, the same measured stride she had carried through classified corridors and forward operating bases and rooms full of people who underestimated her until they no longer had the standing to. The elevator arrived. She stepped in. She did not look back at the apartment door. There was nothing behind it she had not already accounted for, nothing she had left that she intended to retrieve. The building had been emptied of everything that mattered. The lobby came into view. She walked out into the city like a woman with somewhere specific to be. Because she was. He was waiting where he always waited. Not at the entrance, not positioned to be seen, but at the precise angle that allowed him to see everything while appearing to observe nothing. A black car, unmarked, idling 20 feet from the lobby exit. He stood beside it with his hands at his sides and his eyes already on her before she cleared the door. This was not surveillance.
It was the particular attention of a man who has correctly identified something rare and has spent years ensuring nothing happens to it before it is ready. His name, in the rooms where his actual business was conducted, was not Eugene. Eugene was the name on the consultancy paperwork, the name Caleb's assistant had typed into the security clearance form 18 months ago, without asking a single follow-up question, because the references had been impeccable and the fee had been paid without negotiation, and men who pay without negotiating make administrative staff incurious. His real name carried weight in 3 hemispheres and silence in a 4th. He was 44 years old and had not raised his voice in a professional context in 11 years because he had not needed to. He opened the car door when she was 6 feet away, not before. He had learned early that opening it too soon read as performance, and performance was something neither of them had any use for. She got in, he closed the door and settled into the front without a word. They had met 5 years ago in a situation that appeared, from the outside, to have nothing to do with either of their current lives. A logistics corridor in a city that does not appear in the relevant official reports. A decision point that had a right answer and a wrong answer, and approximately 90 seconds in which to determine which was which. Eugene had known the right answer. He had also known, in that corridor, that he was not going to be the one to execute it in time. Jane had been there for reasons her clearance level still did not permit her to discuss. She made the call without hesitation, without introduction, and without asking for anything in return. The situation resolved. She had walked away before he could speak. He had spent the following 3 weeks locating her through channels that did not officially exist. He had not approached her to repay a debt. He was precise about this distinction in his own accounting. A debt implied a ceiling, a fixed amount, a point of settlement, a moment when the obligation concluded. What he felt was not a debt. It was recognition, the specific, clarifying recognition of encountering someone whose operational mind operated at a frequency he had spent his entire life believing was singular to himself. He had built toward this for 2 years. Not toward the decommission, not toward the gala, not toward the document he carried in his interior pocket and had carried for 19 months. He had built toward the moment when Jane would be positioned to be seen accurately by the right room at the right amplitude. That moment was 46 hours away. He drove, and she watched the city move past the window, and neither of them spoke, because nothing they needed to say required saying yet. The first call came at 6 a.m. Caleb was still asleep. He had stayed up until nearly 2, alternating between a glass of something expensive and the quiet, self-reinforcing logic of a man who has decided the story is not over. She would come back. She always came back from deployment, from briefings, from the long silences she carried like a second uniform. This was no different. He had told himself this with enough repetition that by the time he finally slept, he had almost made it true. His COO's name on the screen at 6 a.m. broke that open. The Hartwell contract server had gone unresponsive overnight. Not down, unresponsive. The distinction, his COO explained in the careful language of someone who does not yet understand what they are looking at, was that the infrastructure appeared intact. The credentials simply no longer worked. All of them, simultaneously, as though the server had been issued a new language overnight and forgotten to distribute the dictionary. Caleb told him to get the IT director on it and went back to sleep. The second call came at 8. The federal liaison for the Meridian contract had left a message. Routine, his assistant said, a credential verification request, standard protocol. Caleb authorized the response and took a shower and told himself that government systems threw these errors quarterly and it meant nothing. By noon, it meant something. 3 separate contractors had reported access failures across 2 different server environments. His IT director, a precise and unflappable man who had managed enterprise infrastructure for 11 years, used the word anomaly 4 times in a single briefing and could not meet Caleb's eyes when asked for a projected resolution window. The word anomaly was the word people used when they did not have a better word, when the thing in front of them did not behave like anything they had been trained to diagnose. Caleb sat at the head of the conference table and listened and felt for the first time something that was not quite fear but was adjacent to it, the particular unease of a man who has built his confidence on a foundation he never personally inspected. He called Jane at 2 p.m. The number rang to a voicemail that had been set up that morning, professional and brief, giving nothing. He left a message that was more controlled than he felt and hung up and told his assistant to contact their joint accounts manager. The account manager called back in 11 minutes. The accounts Jane's name appeared on had been restructured, not closed, restructured, legally through a process that had apparently been initiated 6 weeks ago and completed with full documentation he was only now being informed existed. His attorney, reached at 3 p.m., asked him to repeat the timeline twice and then went quiet in a way that attorneys only go quiet when they are calculating how much trouble the silence is worth. Caleb sat alone in his office as the city went gold outside the glass. This was not a tantrum. He understood that now, with the cold arriving certainty of a man who has just realized he was never watching a storm. He was standing inside a demolition, and the charges had been placed long before he heard the first crack.
His attorney's name was Richard Voss, and he had been practicing corporate and family law for 23 years, and he was not, by nature, a man who admitted the limits of his competence easily. He admitted them on the phone to Caleb at 9 a.m. the following morning in the careful, measured cadence of someone delivering information they would prefer not to be associated with. The joint accounts, all 4 of them, had been legally restructured 43 days prior. Not joined, restructured. The distinction, Voss explained, was important and deliberately so. Draining an account was visible, retaliatory, the kind of move that left marks in a proceeding. What Jane had done was cleaner than that. She had redistributed assets across individually held instruments in a sequence that was entirely compliant, entirely documented, and entirely unreachable by any freeze Caleb could now instruct a court to authorize. He was not freezing accounts. He was freezing the memory of accounts that had already been something else for 6 weeks. Caleb instructed him to file anyway. Voss filed. The counter-response arrived in 4 business hours, a document referencing 3 prior filings, 2 notarized asset declarations, and a legal partition that had been established, Caleb's own attorney noted with audible discomfort, by a firm he did not recognize, operating out of an address that resolved to a registered agent service in a state neither of them had expected. The private investigator Caleb retained on the second day reported the following. Jane's address of record was a mail forwarding service. Her vehicle registration had been updated to an address that did not correspond to any residential property. Her personal phone number was active, but routed through a VoIP service that the investigator's contacts could not immediately trace. Her known associates, the ones Caleb could name, had not heard from her in a manner they were willing to discuss. The one exception was a retired signals officer who told the investigator, politely and without elaboration, that he had the wrong number, despite having answered on the first ring. Caleb read the report in his car, parked in the structure beneath his building, engine running. She had not run. That was the part he kept returning to, the detail that would not resolve into anything comfortable. A woman who runs leaves gaps, forwarding addresses that slip, accounts that get accessed from traceable locations, the ordinary entropy of someone moving fast and scared. Jane had left no gaps. Every closure was deliberate. Every document was dated in a sequence that told a coherent, legally unassailable story of a woman who had been preparing not in panic, but in certainty, the way you prepare when you already know the outcome and are simply managing the interval between decision and execution. He thought about the board meetings, the 3 consecutive days she had scheduled for him, dense with agenda items he had not questioned because they had seemed, at the time, like exactly what he had asked his assistant to arrange. He had never once thought to ask who had actually arranged them. He sat in the parking structure for a long time. Outside, the city continued without him.
The annual infrastructure summit had always been Caleb's room. He had earned that designation over a decade of deliberate presence, the right donations to the right foundations, the right remarks from the right podiums, the careful cultivation of a reputation that preceded him through every entrance he made. People turned when Caleb arrived, not always visibly, not always consciously, but they turned. He had come to rely on it the way he relied on the view from the 58th floor, as confirmation of an order he had decided was natural. He arrived with 2 security personnel and the particular momentum of a man who has decided that forward motion is the only remaining asset worth deploying. He had spent 4 days being told what he could not do. Tonight, he had come to do something. He saw her before he had fully cleared the entrance. She was standing near the north window, the city burning gold behind the glass in the specific way it did at this hour. And she was not standing the way guests stand at events like this, with the slight ambient uncertainty of people negotiating a room. She was standing the way a principal stands, the way someone stands when the room has already been briefed on their presence and has made its adjustments accordingly. 3 men Caleb did not recognize were positioned at intervals around her. Eugene stood to her left, hands at his sides, watching the room with the unhurried attention of a man who has already accounted for every person in it. The people nearest her were not socializing, they were orienting. Caleb's 2 security personnel stopped walking before he did. He turned to look at them and found them regarding the 3 men around Jane with the expression of professionals who have just completed an unfavorable comparison and arrived at a conclusion they were not paid enough to argue with. One of them met his eyes and communicated with admirable economy that they would be near the bar. He crossed the room alone. Jane turned when he was 8 feet away, not in surprise, but in the manner of someone who had known the precise moment of his arrival and had been selecting the correct time to acknowledge it. "You need to stop this," he said, keeping his voice beneath the room's ambient noise, aware of the audience in the way he had always been aware of audiences. "Whatever you've done, the servers, the clearances, the accounts, you reverse it tonight." Eugene reached into his interior jacket pocket and removed a single document. He did not hand it to Caleb. He held it at an angle that addressed the immediate space between them, the way you present evidence when the surrounding room is the point. 19 months ago, Eugene said, his voice carrying with the specific clarity of someone who has calculated the acoustics. Your company's primary debt instrument was acquired through a private capital vehicle. The acquisition has been held in trust pending a defined set of conditions. The room, which had been paying attention since Jane arrived, went quiet in the particular way of people who have stopped moving their drinks. Those conditions, Eugene continued, were met 4 days ago. He named the number. It was not a number that shocked ordinary people. It was a number that reorganized rooms. Several guests near them shifted their weight. Several others found reasons to step closer. Caleb's attorney, standing 20 feet away with the glass he had stopped raising halfway to his mouth, went very still. Caleb looked at the document. He recognized the instrument. He recognized his own signature on the lower right corner of the 4th page, placed there 18 months ago in a meeting he had attended with the comfortable inattention of a man for whom the money had been immediate and the terms had seemed distant. He looked at Jane. She was watching him the way she had watched him across the living room 4 days ago, with the same clear, forward attention, no satisfaction, no performance, just the steady, undecorated focus of a woman who has run every model and is now simply present for the output. "You did this," he said. It was not an accusation. It was the sound of a man arriving, too late, at the correct answer. They moved quietly.
That was the detail the room would retain longest. Not the badges, not the words, but the particular economy of four people entering a space and crossing it without urgency, without announcement, in the manner of individuals for whom the outcome has already been established, and the only remaining variable is choreography. They positioned themselves at intervals around Caleb with the unhurried precision of a process that had been in motion for far longer than anyone in this room had been aware of. One of them stepped forward and produced credentials. Several people in the immediate vicinity recognized the designation on the fold and responded by taking a half step back in the involuntary, reflexive way of people who understand institutional authority when it presents itself without theater. Caleb looked at the credentials, then at the man holding them, then, briefly, at his own attorney across the room, who had lowered his glass entirely now and was wearing the expression of a lawyer performing a rapid and unfavorable calculation about the evening's trajectory. The charge was not read loudly. The room was already quiet enough that it didn't need to be. Fraudulent licensing of classified military architecture to government infrastructure contractors, the Meridian framework, its core encryption structure, its 3 years of classified development presented under false authorship to Pentagon liaisons and subsequently licensed to federal contractors for whom the security implications of that misrepresentation were still being assessed by people with the appropriate clearance to do so. The filing date, the investigator noted, was 22 days prior. Caleb heard this and understood with the cold and arriving finality of a man watching the last wall come down that everything he had said in the past 4 days, to his attorneys, to his board, to the 3 investors he had called the morning after Jane left, with the confident, damage-controlling fluency of a man who believed he was still managing a narrative, had been said inside an already active federal record. Every reassurance, every reframing, every careful, practiced assertion that this was a personal dispute and not a structural one. All of it, already documented. He looked at Jane. He did not know what he was looking for. Some residue of the marriage, perhaps. Some trace of the woman who had pressed her hand against her sternum in their living room 4 days ago with a single tear tracking down her face. Some evidence that this had cost her something, that somewhere beneath the operational precision there was a wound that matched his own, that the accounting was mutual. She gave him nothing. Not cruelty, not satisfaction, not the performed indifference of someone suppressing feeling, simply the clean, forward attention of a woman whose mission has reached its designated endpoint and whose focus has already moved to what comes next. They walked him toward the exit. The room watched and did not speak and did not look away. The room had not yet fully exhaled when Eugene moved to its center. He did not raise his hand for attention. He did not require the gesture. He simply repositioned himself by 12 feet, and the room reoriented around him the way rooms reorient around people who have never needed to ask for that particular courtesy. Conversations that had resumed in the wake of Caleb's exit dissolved mid-sentence. Glasses stopped moving. The ambient noise of a gathering full of powerful people reduced itself, without instruction, to silence. He spoke at a conversational volume. Every word reached the edges of the room without effort. He began with the Meridian framework, not its commercial history, not the contracts, not the valuation figures that had appeared in industry publications under the Caleb's company letterhead. He began with its architecture, the underlying encryption logic, the classified structural decisions that had made it not merely functional, but generationally ahead of anything currently deployed in comparable federal infrastructure. He spoke about it with the specific fluency of someone who had read every line of the original build documentation and understood what he was reading. He named the date it was completed. He named the location, a kitchen floor, 4 a.m., and a building 58 floors above the city, while a fundraising gala wound down in the room above. He named the person who built it. Not as a former spouse, the room had already cataloged that information, and it was not the relevant designation. Not as a decorated officer, though the record was available to anyone with the appropriate clearance and the patience to request it. He introduced her as the originating architect of the Meridian Framework, its sole author of record, and its primary stakeholder in the infrastructure partnership whose formation he was announcing to this room tonight as its first public disclosure. Then he paused for exactly one beat, and he introduced her by a second title, speaking it in the direction of the portion of the room that operated in the same deliberate shadow Eugene had always occupied, the people who had come tonight already knowing more than their table assignments suggested. The title was not decorative, it was not honorary. In the architecture of the world those people inhabited, it was a transfer of operational authority over the entire syndicate's Eastern Front, effective and irrevocable, conferred by the one person in the hemisphere with the standing to confer it. The room's response was not applause in the conventional sense. What moved through it was older than applause, and considerably more substantial, the specific collective recognition of people who have just correctly identified, for the first time, the actual center of gravity in a room they believed they already understood. Jane stepped forward into the city light that fell through the northern glass. Her shoulders were level, her chin was exactly where it had always been, her hands were still. She looked like what she had always been, in the classified corridors, in the kitchen at 4 a.m., in the living room doorway with one hand pressed flat against her sternum and a single tear she had not bothered to wipe. The most dangerous person present. Caleb had looked at the uniform and seen a boundary. It was never a boundary. It was the beginning of everything that had just ended him.
She didn't win because she got angry. She won because she never let him see what she was building. That is the part worth sitting with long after the story ends. Not the gala, not the arrest, not the moment Eugene spoke her name into a room full of people who finally had no choice but to hear it. The part worth sitting with is the kitchen floor at 4 a.m., the silent terminal, the 4 seconds in the doorway. Every moment Caleb looked directly at the architecture of his own undoing and saw nothing because he had already decided what she was capable of and never once thought to look again. He didn't lose because she was extraordinary. He lost because he was certain she wasn't. There is a particular kind of danger that lives inside people who have learned to work in silence. Not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone who has already said everything that matters in the only language that counts: action, preparation, patience precise enough to be mistaken for compliance. Jane was never compliant. She was loading, and the most expensive lesson Khaled would carry out of that room, past the federal record and the call debt and the contract that bore his signature on page 4, was simply this: the people who ask for nothing are not the people who need nothing. They are the people who have already taken inventory and found you unnecessary. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in Jane's silence felt less like fiction and more like recognition, then you already know what this channel is about. We don't tell stories about people who were given power. We tell stories about people who were always carrying it, quietly, waiting for the room to catch up. If that is the kind of story you want more of, subscribe right now. Hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next, because the next story is already in motion and it opens in a place nobody expects. Drop a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one, and I want to know what corner of the world this reached. And if Jane's story hit the way I think it did, like it, share it with someone who needs to see it, and then ask yourself one question in the comments. What have you been building in silence that the wrong person completely failed to see? Because that answer, that's the next story, and it might just be yours.